The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly as Vivian Dawson raced across the open plains, her chestnut mare pushing through exhaustion. Behind her, 3 riders pursued with relentless determination, the distance between them shrinking with each passing minute. The saddlebags strapped to her horse contained documents that could bring down the most corrupt land baron in Copper Creek County, evidence that had cost her father his life just 3 days prior. "Come on, Penny," Vivian urged her loyal mare, feeling the animal's labored breathing beneath her. The horse had been running for miles, with barely any rest since they'd fled town before dawn. The nearest settlement was still half a day's ride away, and Vivian knew with sinking certainty that her mare couldn't maintain this pace much longer. The first shot whistled past her ear, followed by a mocking shout from the closest pursuer. Vivian ducked low in the saddle, her long auburn hair escaping from beneath her hat as she veered toward a rocky outcropping in the distance. If she could reach those formations, she might find cover, might lose them in the maze of stone. But Penny stumbled, her stride faltering as she struggled to maintain speed. Vivian felt the change immediately, the once smooth gallop becoming ragged and uneven. "Please, just a little further," she whispered, patting the mare's neck. Another shot rang out, closer this time, and Vivian felt rather than heard Penny's agonized whinny as the bullet found its mark. The world tilted suddenly as the mare collapsed beneath her, sending Vivian tumbling across the hard, packed earth. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, stars dancing across her vision as pain lanced through her side and shoulder. She tried to rise, to reach for the revolver holstered at her hip, but her limbs refused to cooperate, her head spinning from the fall. Through blurred vision, she saw her beloved Penny lying motionless 20 feet away, blood staining the dusty ground beneath her still form. The sight brought tears to Vivian's eyes as she made another futile attempt to stand. The hoofbeats of her pursuers grew louder, but before they could reach her, another sound cut through the air, the rapid approach of a single rider from the direction of the rock formation. Vivian struggled to focus as a tall figure on a powerful black stallion thundered between her and her pursuers. The newcomer's revolver barked 3 times in quick succession, and she heard shouts of alarm as her hunters retreated. The mysterious rider dismounted in a fluid motion, rushing to where she lay half-conscious on the ground. Strong hands gently turned her over, and Vivian found herself looking up into the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face partially obscured by the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. "Miss, can you hear me?" His voice was deep, tinged with concern. "Penny," she whispered, her gaze drifting toward her fallen companion. The stranger glanced toward the horse, his expression grim as he took in the mare's lifeless form. When he looked back at Vivian, he noticed her eyelids fluttering, her consciousness slipping away. "Don't you dare give up on me now," he said firmly, giving her shoulder a gentle shake. "Those men will be back with reinforcements. We need to move." Vivian tried to respond, but darkness was closing in around the edges of her vision. The last thing she registered was being lifted into strong arms, the scent of leather and gunpowder surrounding her as consciousness finally slipped away. When Vivian next opened her eyes, she was lying on a bedroll inside what appeared to be a small cabin. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, casting warm light across rough-hewn walls. She attempted to sit up, only to wince as pain shot through her ribs. "I wouldn't move too quickly if I were you," came that same deep voice from earlier. "You took quite a fall." The man who had rescued her moved into her field of vision, crouching beside her with a cup of water. He was even more handsome than her hazy memory suggested, tall and broad-shouldered, with features that might have been carved from granite if not for the gentleness in his eyes. Dark hair fell in waves to his collar, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his strong jaw. "Where am I?" Vivian asked, accepting the water with shaking hands. "My hunting cabin, about 10 miles from where I found you." He helped steady the cup as she drank. "Name's Lucas Marshall." "Most folks call me Luke." Vivian Dawson, she replied after satisfying her thirst. Thank you for saving me, Mr. Marshall. Luke, he corrected with a slight smile. And you're welcome, though I'm curious what a young woman was doing riding hell bent across open country with Harlan Preston's men in pursuit. Vivian tensed at the mention of Preston, her fingers instinctively reaching for the saddlebags that were no longer by her side. Panic flashed across her face. My saddlebags, the documents, they're safe, Luke assured her, nodding toward a corner where her belongings rested. I grabbed them before we left, figured they must be important if Preston's boys were willing to kill for them. Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by suspicion. You know Preston, a shadow crossed Luke's face, his jaw tightening. Everyone in these parts knows Preston. Question is, why are his men after you specifically? Vivian hesitated, uncertain whether to trust this stranger despite his intervention. But something in his eyes, a hardness that appeared whenever Preston's name was mentioned, convinced her he was no ally of the land baron. Those papers prove Preston forged land deeds throughout the county. He's been driving families off their rightful property for years. Her voice caught as she added, including my father. When he discovered the truth and confronted Preston, they said it was an accident, a fall from his horse. Understanding dawned on Luke's face. You're Jonathan Dawson's daughter. Vivian's eyes widened. You knew my father, we crossed paths a few times. Honest man, too honest for his own good in these parts. Luke stood, moving toward the fireplace. The whole county attended his funeral 3 days ago. Preston himself delivered a eulogy praising Jonathan's character while barely concealing his satisfaction. I couldn't bear to watch that monster pretend to mourn, Vivian said bitterly. Instead, I broke into his office while everyone was at the ceremony. Found ledgers, correspondence with the land office in Tucson, evidence of everything he's done. Luke whistled low. Brave, foolish, but brave. He stirred something in a pot hanging over the fire. The question now is what you plan to do with that evidence. Take it to Judge Hollister in Silver Springs. He's an old friend of my father's and one of the few officials not in Preston's pocket. Vivian pushed herself into a sitting position, wincing again. How badly am I hurt? Bruised ribs, some scrapes, and what might be a mild concussion. Nothing broken, but you'll be sore for a while. Luke filled a bowl with what smelled like rabbit stew and brought it to her. You should eat, regain your strength. We can figure out our next move after. Vivian questioned, accepting the bowl. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Luke's eyes. You think I'd go to the trouble of rescuing you just to send you riding back into danger alone? Preston's men will be watching every trail to Silver Springs, especially now they know you escaped. As she ate, Vivian studied her rescuer more carefully. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to danger, and the calluses on his hands spoke of hard work. Yet there was a refinement to his speech that suggested education beyond what most frontier men received. Why help me? She finally asked, You're taking a considerable risk. Luke was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. Let's just say Harlan Preston and I have unfinished business. He turned back to her with an expression that ended further questioning. Rest now. We'll leave at first light tomorrow, take a route they won't expect. Despite her curiosity about this mysterious man, exhaustion soon pulled Vivian back toward sleep. The last thing she remembered was watching Luke check his revolvers by the fire, his profile outlined in amber light, a sentinel against the darkness beyond the cabin walls. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the Arizona territory as Luke gently shook Vivian awake. She opened her eyes to find him already dressed and ready, a steaming cup of coffee in his outstretched hand. How are you feeling? He asked as she slowly sat up, testing her various aches and pains. Like I was trampled by a herd of buffalo, she admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth spread through her fingers as she took a cautious sip. But I'll manage. Luke nodded approvingly. I've packed provisions for 3 days. With luck, we can reach Silver Springs by nightfall tomorrow if we take the high trail through Apache Pass. Vivian nearly choked on her coffee. Apache Pass. That's a dangerous route. Which is precisely why Preston's men won't expect us to take it, Luke countered, checking the contents of his saddlebags. The Apache in that region have been peaceful since the treaty 2 years ago. Most of the stories you hear now are spread by men like Preston who want to keep settlers away from land they've got their eyes on. As Vivian dressed behind a makeshift screen Luke had considerately arranged, she reflected on how little she knew about the man who had saved her life. "You seem to know this territory well," she called to him. "I've ridden most trails between here and the Colorado over the past 5 years," he replied. "Worked as a scout for the cavalry before that." When Vivian emerged, dressed in her now dusty riding clothes, she found Luke holding out a gun belt with a smaller revolver than his own. "It was my sister's," he explained at her questioning look. "She preferred something lighter when we traveled. You know how to use one." Vivian took the weapon, checking it with practiced ease. "My father insisted I learn, said a woman alone in these territories needed to protect herself." A sad smile touched her lips. He was right, though I never thought I'd need those skills so soon. Luke seemed satisfied with her handling of the firearm. "We'll leave your saddlebags here, concealed. No sense carrying incriminating evidence if we're stopped." "Leave them," Vivian protested. "But they're the whole reason I've memorized the key documents," Luke interrupted. "Names, dates, property descriptions. If we make it to Judge Hollister, he can send trusted men back for the originals." He met her eyes steadily. "Your father died for those papers, Miss Dawson. I don't intend to let his sacrifice be in vain, but neither will I risk your life unnecessarily." The wisdom of his plan was undeniable, though it pained Vivian to leave behind what had cost her father everything. Once she reluctantly agreed, Luke efficiently concealed the saddlebags beneath a loose floorboard. Outside, a magnificent black stallion stamped impatiently beside a sturdy bay mare. "This is Thunder," Luke said, patting the stallion's neck. "And the mare is Willow. She's steady and sure-footed, perfect for the mountain trails ahead." Vivian approached the mare, stroking her velvety muzzle. "She's beautiful." A lump formed in her throat as memories of Penny flooded back. "I couldn't even bury her," she whispered, more to herself than to Luke. A warm hand rested briefly on her shoulder. "I'm sorry about your horse," Luke said quietly. "She must have been special. Had her since she was a foal." Vivian blinked back tears, refusing to give in to grief when danger still loomed. "My father gave her to me for my 16th birthday, said she had heart. He was right." Luke checked Willow's saddle cinch, then offered his cupped hands to help Vivian mount. Despite her soreness, she settled into the saddle with the natural grace of someone who had spent much of her life on horseback. "Stay alert," Luke advised as he swung onto Thunder's back. "If we encounter anyone, let me do the talking. Most know me as a trapper and guide in these parts." "You're my client's daughter, traveling to meet him in Silver Springs after missing the stagecoach." Vivian nodded, impressed by his forethought. "And if we encounter Preston's men specifically?" Luke's expression hardened. "Then we ride hard and hope they're poor shots." He urged Thunder forward, adding over his shoulder, "But let's try to avoid that particular scenario." They rode at a steady pace, keeping to wooded areas when possible to minimize their visibility from a distance. Luke led them on a circuitous route that seemed designed to confuse any potential followers, occasionally doubling back or crossing streams to break their trail. As the morning warmed, Vivian studied her companion's broad back. Though he maintained a watchful vigilance, there was an ease to his posture that spoke of countless hours in the saddle. Occasionally, he would point out landmarks or signs of wildlife, his knowledge of the land evident in every observation. "May I ask a personal question, Mr. Marshall?" Vivian ventured during a brief rest to water the horses at a small creek. "You saved my life yesterday. I think that earns you the right to ask whatever you wish," he replied, though a certain wariness entered his expression. "You mentioned a sister. Is she nearby?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. Whatever he had been bracing for, it wasn't this. "No," he answered after a moment. Elizabeth moved back east after her husband died at Shiloh. She's in Boston now with her son. You fought in the war. Vivian asked, noting the shadow that crossed his features at the mention of the conflict that had torn the nation apart less than a decade earlier. Union cavalry. Served under Sheridan. His tone discouraged further inquiry on that topic, but he surprised her by adding, "What about you?" "Any family besides your father?" Vivian shook her head, watching ripples spread across the creek's surface. "My mother died of fever when I was 12. No siblings. It was just father and me for the past 10 years. She looked up at him. "We had each other and the ranch. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was home. And Preston took it," Luke stated rather than asked, 3 months ago, claimed there was a problem with our deed dating back to when the territory was still Mexican land. Her hands clenched into fists. "Father knew it was false, but the local magistrate is Preston's cousin by marriage. We had nowhere to turn. So you moved to town." Vivian nodded. "Father took work as a clerk in the land office, hoping to find evidence of Preston's scheme from the inside, and he did eventually." Luke helped her back onto Willow, their conversation pausing as they returned to the trail. As they approached a steep incline leading toward the mountains, he fell back to ride alongside her. "Your father was a brave man," he said quietly. "Not many would have had the courage to stand against someone like Preston, especially after losing everything." "He believed justice would prevail if the truth came to light," Vivian replied, blinking back tears. "I have to believe the same, or his death meant nothing." Luke's gaze held hers for a long moment. "Then we'll make sure the truth does come to light, Miss Dawson, whatever it takes." As they climbed higher into the foothills, the terrain became increasingly challenging. Luke led them along game trails that wound through dense pine forests, occasionally stopping to check their back trail or consult landmarks visible only to his experienced eye. By mid-afternoon, they had reached an elevation that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. Vivian gasped at the sight, miles of rugged beauty stretching to the horizon, painted in shades of ochre, crimson, and gold. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, reining Willow to a stop beside Luke. "Worth fighting for, isn't it?" He replied, his eyes scanning the distant landscape with a strange mixture of appreciation and sadness. "This land." Before Vivian could respond, Luke suddenly stiffened, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. Following his gaze, she spotted a thin column of smoke rising from a stand of trees about a mile ahead on their planned route. "That's no campfire," Luke said grimly. "Too controlled. Someone's waiting." "Preston's men?" Vivian asked, anxiety coiling in her stomach. "Possibly. They could have guessed we'd head for the pass." He studied the terrain, considering alternatives. "We could circle wide to avoid them, but it would add half a day to our journey." Vivian straightened in her saddle. "We can't afford the delay. The longer we take, the more time Preston has to cover his tracks." Luke gave her an appraising look. "There's another option, riskier, but it might work." He pointed to a narrow ridge running parallel to their current position. "That leads to a series of caves. Used to be an old mining operation before the war. We could go through rather than around." "You know these caves?" Vivian asked. A shadow passed over Luke's features. "Yes, though I haven't been back in nearly 3 years." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, but he quickly continued. "The main tunnel runs directly beneath the ridge for about a mile. If we can make it through before nightfall, we'll be well past whoever's waiting ahead." Despite her misgivings about underground spaces, Vivian nodded her agreement. Luke led them off the main trail, following what appeared to be little more than a deer path up toward the rocky ridge. After 20 minutes of careful climbing, they reached a small plateau where the mouth of a cave yawned dark and uninviting. "We'll need to lead the horses," Luke said, dismounting. "The ceiling's high enough in most places, but they'll be nervous." He lit a small lantern he extracted from his pack, the flickering flame barely pushing back the darkness that swallowed the cave entrance. Vivian slid from Willow's back, patting the mare's neck reassuringly as she sensed the animal's unease. "Stay close," Luke advised, checking his revolvers before taking Thunder's reins in one hand and the lantern in the other. The main passage is straightforward, but there are side tunnels where it's easy to get lost. Vivian drew her borrowed revolver, keeping it ready as she followed Luke into the cave with Willow reluctantly trailing behind. The temperature dropped immediately, a damp coolness replacing the afternoon heat. Their footsteps echoed oddly, creating ghostly reverberations that seemed to follow them deeper into the mountain. As they progressed, Vivian noticed weathered support beams at regular intervals, remnants of the mining operation Luke had mentioned. Occasionally, their light would catch on the gleam of abandoned tools or rusted rail tracks partially buried in the earthen floor. "What did they mine here?" she asked, her voice hushed in the oppressive silence. "Silver, mostly, some copper." Luke held the lantern higher, illuminating a section where the tunnel widened into what must have been a working area. Ancient-looking equipment loomed in the shadows like sleeping monsters. "The vein played out around 58, if I recall correctly. You seem to know a lot about it." Luke was quiet for several paces before responding. "My father worked these mines before settling on ranching. Brought me through here once when I was a boy, showing me where he'd spent his early years in the territory." He glanced back at her. "Said he wanted me to understand that fortunes built on taking from the earth never last, that only what you build with your own hands on the surface has permanence." "Wise man," Vivian commented. "Yes." Luke's voice held a distant quality. "He was." They continued in silence, the horses growing increasingly restless as they ventured deeper. Thunder, despite his imposing size, seemed to trust Luke implicitly, following with minimal resistance. Willow was more hesitant, requiring frequent reassurance from Vivian. Suddenly, Luke halted, raising his hand in warning. Vivian strained to hear what had alerted him, catching only the drip of water from somewhere deeper in the tunnel. "What is it?" she whispered. "Not sure, thought I heard something ahead." Luke handed her the lantern. "Stay here with the horses. I'll scout ahead." Before Vivian could protest, he disappeared into the darkness, moving with silent efficiency that spoke of military training. Left alone with only the small circle of lantern light for company, Vivian fought rising panic. The darkness seemed to press in around her, alive with imagined threats. Willow nudged her shoulder nervously, as if seeking reassurance that Vivian herself desperately needed. Minutes stretched interminably until finally, the sound of approaching footsteps heralded Luke's return. His expression was grim as he emerged from the shadows. "The tunnel ahead has partially collapsed," he reported. "There's a way through, but it's narrow. The horses will have to go single file and will need to duck low in places." "Is it safe?" Vivian asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. Luke hesitated just long enough for her to know the honest answer before he said, "Safe enough. I've checked the support beams. The collapse is old, not recent." They proceeded more cautiously, Luke leading Thunder while Vivian followed with Willow. The tunnel narrowed alarmingly, the ceiling dipping so low in places that they had to bend nearly double. Vivian's heartbeat thundered in her ears, each creak of the ancient timbers above sending jolts of fear through her. "Almost through," Luke encouraged as they navigated a particularly tight section. Just another 100 yards and his words cut off as a distant rumble echoed through the passage. Dust sifted down from above and Vivian felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. "Move," Luke shouted, urgency replacing his usual calm. Now, Vivian didn't need to be told twice. She urged Willow forward as Luke practically dragged Thunder through the narrowing passage. The rumbling grew louder and larger chunks of rock began to fall around them. "Cave in," Luke called over the growing din. "We need to reach the junction ahead." They broke into a desperate run, the horses snorting in terror as the mountain seemed to come alive around them. Just as the roar became deafening, Luke shoved Vivian and Willow into a side passage, following immediately with Thunder. An explosion of dust and debris billowed past the entrance of their refuge, as a section of the main tunnel collapsed completely. Coughing and blinded, Vivian felt Luke's arm around her waist, pulling her deeper into the side passage until the worst of the dust cloud had passed. When she could finally see again, she found herself pressed against the rocky wall, Luke's body partially shielding hers as if he could protect her from the mountain itself. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his face inches from hers, covered in a fine layer of rock dust that made his blue eyes stand out even more starkly. "No," she managed between coughs. "The horses." Luke glanced over his shoulder. "They're spooked but uninjured." As the dust settled, the full extent of their predicament became clear. The main passage was completely blocked by fallen rock, cutting off their planned exit. "What now?" Vivian asked, struggling to keep panic from her voice. Luke ran a hand through his dust-coated hair, leaving it standing in unruly spikes. "This side tunnel. It should connect with another vertical shaft about half a mile in. Miners used it as an emergency exit if memory serves. And if it doesn't," his eyes met hers, unflinching. "Then we find another way. I didn't save you from Preston's men just to let you die in a mine cave-in, Miss Dawson." Despite everything, Vivian found herself smiling at his determination. "I believe you would argue with death itself on my behalf, Mr. Marshall." Something shifted in Luke's expression, a softening, a vulnerability quickly masked. "Let's keep moving. The air will be better further from the collapse." They continued through the side passage, which proved narrower and less maintained than the main tunnel. Luke's earlier confidence in navigating seemed slightly diminished, suggesting this route was less familiar to him. Still, he moved forward with determination, occasionally consulting marks on the wall that must have been left by the original miners. "How did you become so knowledgeable about these caves?" Vivian asked after they had been walking for what felt like hours, the question partly meant to distract herself from their precarious situation. Luke was silent long enough that Vivian thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "After the war, I returned to find Preston had taken my family's ranch, much like he took yours. Claimed my father had defaulted on loans while I was away fighting." His voice hardened. "My father died defending our land. My mother passed shortly after from grief, according to neighbors." Vivian's heart ached for him. "I'm so sorry, Luke. I spent months gathering evidence, just like your father did. These caves became my hideout when Preston's men were hunting me." He paused at a fork in the tunnel, studying the worn markings before choosing the right path. "Eventually, I took what I'd found to the territorial governor in Santa Fe. He promised justice, promised to investigate. But Preston has friends in high places. Money buys influence, even with men who consider themselves honorable." The bitterness in Luke's voice was palpable. "The investigation found no wrongdoing. I was advised to leave the territory if I valued my life. Yet you stayed," Vivian observed. Luke glanced back at her, something fierce burning in his eyes. "This is my home. I won't be driven from it by thieves and murderers who hide behind legal papers and political connections." "Is that why you helped me? Because my fight against Preston is your fight too, initially?" "Yes." Luke's honesty was refreshing, if a bit disarming. But now, he trailed off, focusing his attention on a section where the tunnel ceiling dipped precariously low. "Now," Vivian prompted when they had safely navigated the hazard. Luke didn't immediately answer, leading them around a sharp bend where the passage suddenly widened into a natural cavern. Their lantern revealed a breathtaking sight: stalactites hanging like frozen daggers from the ceiling, while corresponding stalagmites reached upward from the floor, some meeting to form columns that seemed to support the very mountain above them. "It's beautiful," Vivian breathed, momentarily forgetting their danger. "The miners called it the cathedral," Luke said, his voice softening with appreciation. "They'd hold services here on Sundays, said it was the closest place to heaven you could find underground." Vivian moved to the center of the cavern, turning slowly to take in the majesty of the natural wonder. The horses seemed to relax as well, the more open space easing their claustrophobia. "To answer your question," Luke finally continued, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret in the dim light. "Now I'm helping you because you deserve justice, because your courage in the face of overwhelming odds is remarkable." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the play of lantern light across his features. "And because I haven't met anyone like you in a very long time, Vivian Dawson." The use of her first name sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. Standing in this underground cathedral, coated in dust and facing uncertain odds, Vivian realized with startling clarity that she was developing feelings for this enigmatic cowboy who had risked everything to save a stranger. Before she could formulate a response, a distant sound echoed through the cavern voices, accompanied by the unmistakable glow of approaching lanterns from a passage on the far side. Luke's hand moved instantly to his revolver. "Get behind that column," he instructed in a whisper, extinguishing their lantern with a quick movement. Darkness enveloped them, broken only by the growing light from the approaching party. Vivian led the horses to shelter behind a massive rock formation, then positioned herself where Luke had indicated, drawing her own weapon. The voices grew clearer. 3 men, maybe 4, their casual conversation suggesting they were unaware of Luke and Vivian's presence. Luke crouched beside a stalagmite formation 20 feet away, perfectly positioned to ambush the newcomers if necessary. The first figure to emerge into the cavern was tall and lean, dressed in the unmistakable garb of Preston's hired guns. 2 more followed, all carrying rifles in addition to their sidearms. "Boss said they'd likely head for the pass," one man commented, holding his lantern high to illuminate the cavern. "Checking these caves is probably a waste of time. Better than sitting in the rain topside," another replied. "Besides, Marshall knows these tunnels. Used to hide out here when the boss was hunting him before." Vivian's breath caught at the confirmation that they were indeed searching for them specifically. She glanced toward Luke, barely able to make out his silhouette in the darkness, and saw him slowly shifting position, preparing to move. "Spread out," the first man ordered. "Check all the side passages. If they came this way, they'll have left tracks in the dust." As the men began to fan out, Vivian realized they would inevitably discover signs of their passage. The horses had left clear tracks in the fine dust covering the cavern floor. Without warning, a shot rang out, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. One of Preston's men cried out, dropping his lantern as he clutched his shoulder. Luke had made his move, firing from the shadows before rolling to a new position. "It's Marshall," shouted the leader. "Find cover." Chaos erupted as the remaining gunmen scrambled for shelter, firing blindly toward where Luke's shot had originated. Vivian remained frozen behind her column, uncertain whether to join the fight or stay hidden. The decision was made for her when one of the men circled wide, his path taking him dangerously close to her hiding place. As he passed within 10 feet, Willow snorted nervously, alerting him to their presence. "Over here," he shouted, swinging his lantern toward the sound. The light caught Vivian in its glow, momentarily blinding her. The man raised his rifle, but Vivian was faster. Her father's lessons served her well as she fired twice in quick succession. The first shot went wide, but the second found its mark. The gunman staggered back with a cry of pain, his rifle clattering to the stone floor. From across the cavern, Luke was engaged in a deadly exchange with the remaining men. The flashes from his revolver illuminated the space in strobing bursts, accompanied by the thunder of gunfire that reverberated painfully off the stone walls. Vivian moved quickly to retrieve the fallen man's rifle, only to find herself face to face with the leader of Preston's men who had circled around during the confusion. "Well, well. Miss Dawson, I presume," he sneered, his revolver aimed steadily at her chest. "Mr. Preston will be pleased when I bring you back. Less pleased about Marshall, but some accidents can't be helped." "You're making a mistake," Vivian said, stalling for time as she tried to gauge the distance to her own dropped weapon. Preston will hang when the evidence reaches Judge Hollister. The man laughed, an ugly sound that echoed through the cavern. Evidence? You mean those papers you stole? Preston's already got men rewriting every document you took. By tomorrow, there won't be a shred of proof left. A gunshot cracked from somewhere to her right, and the man's eyes widened in surprise. He looked down at the spreading red stain on his chest before crumpling to his knees, then face first onto the cavern floor. Luke emerged from the shadows, smoke still curling from his revolver's barrel. His left sleeve was dark with blood, but his expression showed only concern for her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded. Vivian shook her head, unable to speak as the reality of the close call sank in. Luke quickly checked the fallen men, confirming that none remained a threat. One had fled back the way they had come, leaving his comrades behind. "We need to move," Luke said urgently, retrieving their lantern and relighting it. "The one who escaped will bring reinforcements." "You're wounded," Vivian pointed out, reaching for his injured arm. Luke winced as she examined the bloody tear in his sleeve. "Bullet grazed me. Nothing serious, but we don't have time to tend it now." With renewed urgency, they gathered the horses and continued through the passage the gunmen had used to enter the cavern. It sloped gradually upward, giving Vivian hope that they were finally approaching an exit from the underground labyrinth. After 20 minutes of climbing, they reached a vertical shaft with crude wooden ladders built into one wall. Pale natural light filtered down from above the first glimpse of sky they'd had in hours. "The emergency exit," Luke confirmed, examining the ladders. "They look intact enough. I'll go first to make sure it's safe, then help with the horses." The extraction of the horses proved challenging, requiring makeshift blindfolds to keep them calm as Luke and Vivian worked together to guide them up the narrow shaft. By the time they finally emerged into the open air, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Vivian took a deep, grateful breath, never having appreciated fresh air so thoroughly. They had exited onto a small plateau high on the mountainside, offering a commanding view of the approach from multiple directions. "We should be safe here for the night," Luke decided, looking critically at the darkening sky. "Too dangerous to travel these trails after dark, especially with Preston's men in the area." While Luke secured the horses, Vivian insisted on tending his wound, using water from their canteens and strips torn from her petticoat as bandages. The injury was indeed just a graze, but deep enough to require careful cleaning. "You could have been killed," she said quietly as she worked, her fingers gentle against his skin. "Occupational hazard when dealing with men like Preston," Luke replied with forced lightness, though he couldn't quite hide his wince as she cleaned the wound. "Is that what you do?" "Deal with men like Preston?" Vivian asked, securing the bandage. Luke's eyes met hers, serious now. "I try to help people who can't fight for themselves. Small ranchers, homesteaders, people the powerful see as obstacles to be removed." He flexed his arm, testing her handiwork. "Not the most profitable line of work, but it has its moments. Like rescuing damsels in distress," Vivian teased gently, trying to lighten the mood. A smile tugged at Luke's mouth. "You hardly qualify as a typical damsel in distress, Miss Dawson. Not many ladies I know would face down armed men in a cave with such composure. Nor would many men ride to a stranger's rescue against impossible odds," she countered, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, her hand still resting on his arm. "Thank you, Luke, truly." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Luke's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he cleared his throat and stood. "We should eat something," he said, moving toward his saddlebags. "It'll be a hard ride tomorrow if we want to reach Silver Springs before nightfall." They shared a simple meal of jerky, dried fruit, and hard biscuits as darkness settled completely around them. With the immediate danger past, exhaustion began to claim Vivian, her eyelids growing heavy despite her efforts to stay alert. Luke noticed her fatigue. "Sleep," he encouraged. "I'll take first watch." Too tired to argue, Vivian settled onto the bedroll he offered, drawing her coat tight against the mountain chill. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself watching Luke's silhouette as he sat vigilant at the edge of their small camp, his broad shoulders outlined against the star-filled sky. "Luke," she called softly. He turned toward her, features barely visible in the dim starlight. "Yes. What will you do, after we reach Silver Springs, I mean?" There was a long pause before he answered. "I haven't thought that far ahead, been focused on getting you there safely." Vivian hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind since their conversation in the cavern. "Would you consider staying? In Silver Springs, I mean. Judge Hollister could use a man like you, especially once he moves against Preston. Is that what you want?" Luke's voice was carefully neutral. "For me to stay?" "Yes," Vivian admitted, surprising herself with her candor. I'd like to get to know you better, Luke Marshall, when we're not running for our lives." Though she couldn't see his expression clearly, Vivian sensed the smile in his voice when he replied. "I'd like that too, Vivian Dawson. Now get some rest. Tomorrow's another day." As sleep finally claimed her, Vivian's last conscious thought was that perhaps, amid all the loss and danger, she had found something precious, the beginning of a connection that might heal wounds she hadn't even acknowledged. Dawn brought with it a gentle rain, the soft patter on stone rousing Vivian from the deepest sleep she'd experienced in days. She opened her eyes to find Luke already awake, brewing coffee over a small, well-shielded fire. "Morning," he greeted, offering a tin cup of the steaming liquid. "Sleep well. Better than I had any right to, given the circumstances," she admitted, accepting the coffee gratefully. The warmth seeped into her hands as she took a cautious sip. "How long until we reach Silver Springs?" Luke glanced at the cloudy sky. "If we push hard, we can be there by late afternoon. The rain works in our favor harder for anyone to follow our trail." They broke camp efficiently, Vivian noting how easily they had fallen into a rhythm of working together, anticipating each other's needs with minimal communication. Within 20 minutes, they were mounted and making their way down a steep trail that would eventually connect with the main route to Silver Springs. The journey proved arduous, the rain turning trails into slippery hazards that required careful navigation. Luke led them along ridge lines when possible, using the high ground to scan for pursuers. By midday, they had covered significant distance, the landscape gradually transitioning from rugged mountains to rolling foothills. During a brief stop to rest the horses, Luke suddenly raised his hand for silence, his head cocked as he listened intently. Vivian held her breath, straining to hear whatever had caught his attention. "Riders," he finally said, pointing southwest, "moving fast." Squinting through the light rainfall, Vivian could just make out distant figures, at least 6 horsemen traveling at speed along the valley below. "Preston's men?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Luke's expression was grim. "Most likely. They're cutting across to intercept the main road to Silver Springs." He studied the terrain with narrowed eyes. "They're expecting us to take the direct route. We'll have to go another way." "Is there another way?" Vivian's heart sank at the thought of further delays. "There's always another way," Luke assured her, pointing to a densely wooded ridge running parallel to their intended path. "It's rougher terrain, but it'll keep us hidden. Might even get us there faster if those men waste time waiting where we never show up." The detour took them through thick pine forests where the canopy was so dense that the rainfall barely reached them. The ground was carpeted with needles that muffled their horses' hoofbeats, providing an additional layer of concealment as they pushed forward. As they rode, Vivian found herself studying Luke's profile whenever he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, missing nothing. There was something deeply reassuring about his presence, a sense that no challenge was insurmountable with him by her side. "You're staring," Luke observed without turning his head, a hint of amusement in his voice. Vivian felt heat rise to her cheeks. I was just thinking about how strange life can be. 3 days ago, I was planning my father's memorial service. Now I'm riding through the wilderness with a man I barely know, being hunted by killers. She guided Willow around a fallen log. Yet somehow, I feel safer with you than I did in town surrounded by people I've known my whole life. Luke glanced back at her, his expression softening. Trust your instincts. They've kept you alive so far. And what do your instincts tell you about me? Vivian asked boldly. This time, Luke turned fully in his saddle to look at her, his eyes serious. That you're the kind of person worth risking everything for. The simple sincerity of his words left Vivian momentarily speechless. Before she could formulate a response, Luke had already turned back to the trail, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing since that first moment. He found her collapsed beside her fallen horse. By late afternoon, the rain had ceased, and patches of blue sky appeared between dispersing clouds. They emerged from the forest onto a ridgeline that offered a breathtaking view of a valley below, where a small town was nestled alongside a winding river. Silver Springs, Luke announced, relief evident in his voice. Made it before sunset, as promised. Vivian felt a surge of emotion as she gazed down at the town that represented safety and the hope of justice. I can hardly believe we made it. Not quite there yet, Luke cautioned. We still need to reach Judge Hollister without being spotted by Preston's spies. Every town has them. They approached Silver Springs cautiously, using the lengthening shadows of late afternoon to conceal their arrival. Luke led them to the outskirts, avoiding the main street in favor of back alleys and side roads. Judge Hollister's house is on the north end of town, Vivian informed him. A white 2-story with blue shutters, set back from the road with large oak trees in front. Luke nodded. We'll approach from behind. Less chance of being seen that way. The judge's residence proved easy enough to identify, its manicured grounds standing out among the more modest homes surrounding it. Luke directed them to a small grove of trees behind the property, where they dismounted. Wait here with the horses, he instructed. I'll make sure it's safe. Vivian caught his arm before he could leave. Be careful, Preston has reach even here. Luke's hand covered hers briefly, a reassuring touch. Always am. She watched anxiously as he approached the house, moving with the silent grace of a man accustomed to staying undetected. He disappeared around the corner of a garden shed, leaving Vivian alone with her thoughts and the 2 horses. Minutes stretched interminably. Just as she was considering going after him, Luke reappeared, accompanied by an elderly man with a shock of white hair and the dignified bearing of someone accustomed to commanding respect. Vivian, my dear girl, Judge Hollister called as he approached, arms outstretched. When I received word of Jonathan's death, I feared the worst for you as well. Vivian rushed forward, embracing her father's old friend. Judge Hollister, thank God you're all right. It is I who should be thanking God for your safety, the judge replied, holding her at arm's length to examine her. Mr. Marshall has given me a brief account of your ordeal. You've shown remarkable courage. I couldn't have made it without Luke, Vivian said, glancing toward her rescuer. He saved my life multiple times over. Judge Hollister turned to Luke with newfound respect. Then I owe you a debt I can never repay, young man. Jonathan Dawson was one of my dearest friends. No debt, Your Honor, Luke replied. Bringing Preston to justice is payment enough. The judge's expression grew serious. Come inside, both of you. It isn't safe to linger outdoors. I've instructed my stable hand to care for your horses. Within the safety of Judge Hollister's study, Vivian recounted everything that had happened since her father's death, including their journey and the evidence she had discovered. Luke added details about the men pursuing them and the confrontation in the caves. Preston's reach has grown troubling, the judge mused, pacing before the fireplace. I've received reports from all across the territory of similar land seizures, always cloaked in a veneer of legality. The documents I found prove it's all built on forgeries and threatened witnesses, Vivian insisted. Luke memorized the key details. Luke proceeded to recite names, dates, and property descriptions with precise detail, the judge making careful notes as he spoke. "This is compelling," Hollister acknowledged when Luke finished, "but without the physical evidence." "I concealed the documents in my hunting cabin," Luke explained. "If you can spare trusted men, they could retrieve them within 2 days." The judge considered this. "I have deputies I would trust with my life. They can leave at first light," he turned to Vivian. "In the meantime, my dear, you'll stay here where it's safe. Preston doesn't know you've reached me yet." "And Mr. Marshall?" Vivian asked, trying to keep her voice casual. Judge Hollister glanced between them, something knowing in his gaze. "I would be honored if he would stay as well. My home has ample room, and I suspect Mr. Preston would pay handsomely for information on his whereabouts." Luke hesitated, looking toward Vivian as if seeking her opinion. "Please stay," she said softly, "at least until this is resolved." A hint of a smile touched Luke's lips. "Then I accept your hospitality, Your Honor." The judge's housekeeper, a motherly woman named Mrs. Bennett, showed them to adjacent rooms on the second floor. After days on the trail, the prospect of a hot bath and clean clothes seemed like unimaginable luxury to Vivian. As they reached her door, Luke paused. "I'll be right next door if you need anything." Vivian found herself reluctant to part from him, even for a few hours. "Luke," she began, then faltered, unsure how to express the tumult of emotions she was feeling. He saved her from having to find the words, his hand gently taking hers. "I know," he said quietly. "Get some rest. We're safe now." Later that evening, after they had both bathed and changed into clean clothes provided by their host, Luke in borrowed attire that fit him surprisingly well, they gathered for dinner in the judge's formal dining room. The normality of sitting at a properly set table seemed almost surreal after their wilderness journey. "I've sent telegrams to contacts in Santa Fe and Tucson," Judge Hollister informed them over roast beef and potatoes. "Once we have the physical evidence, we can build a case the territorial governor cannot ignore. Preston won't go down without a fight," Luke warned. The fine white shirt he wore a stark contrast to his sun-bronzed skin. "He'll have men watching every approach to this town by now. Which is precisely why you both must remain here until this matter is concluded," the judge insisted. "My home is well guarded, I assure you." After dinner, Vivian found herself restless despite her exhaustion. She wandered onto the second-floor balcony that overlooked the judge's garden, breathing in the cool night air fragrant with roses. The events of the past days seemed almost dreamlike now, yet the danger remained very real. "Couldn't sleep," Luke's voice came from behind her. Vivian turned to find him standing in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the warm light from inside. "Too much thinking," she admitted as he joined her at the railing. "About my father, about what happens next." "Justice for your father is what happens next," Luke said with quiet certainty. "Preston will pay for what he's done." "And after?" Vivian asked, turning to face him fully. "What happens after justice is served?" Luke's gaze was steady, searching. "What do you want to happen, Vivian?" The directness of his question caught her off guard, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Luke Marshall was not a man who approached anything indirectly. "I want." She began, then gathered her courage. "I want to rebuild, to start over. And I find myself hoping you might be part of that new beginning." Luke stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "I've been alone for a long time," he said softly. "Fighting battles that seemed endless, never staying in one place long enough to call it home." His hand rose to gently brush a strand of hair from her face. "But these past days with you, I've remembered what it feels like to have something worth fighting for beyond justice or revenge." Vivian's heart quickened as his palm came to rest against her cheek. "And what is that something?" she whispered. "A future," Luke answered simply. "One I never imagined for myself until I found you." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened as Vivian's arms wound around his neck, drawing him closer. In that moment, all the danger and uncertainty melted away, leaving only the certainty that whatever came next, they would face it together. When they finally parted, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I should warn you," he murmured, "I'm not the easiest man to build a life with. I've made enemies and I carry scars that go deeper than skin." "As do I," Vivian replied, "but perhaps we can heal together." A discreet cough from the doorway caused them to step apart. Judge Hollister stood there, an apologetic expression on his face. "Forgive the intrusion," he said, though his eyes twinkled with something that suggested he wasn't entirely sorry to have confirmed what he had suspected about their relationship. "A telegram has just arrived that requires immediate attention." The judge led them back to his study, where he unfolded a yellow paper bearing the marks of having traveled through multiple telegraph offices. "It's from my contact in the governor's office," he explained grimly. "Preston has apparently learned of your escape and is taking drastic measures. He's accelerated his plans, filing legal claims on a dozen more properties across the county. More troubling, he's convinced the sheriff in Copper Creek to issue warrants for both your arrests on charges of theft and murder." "Murder?" Vivian exclaimed. "That's absurd." "The bodies of his men in the cave," Luke realized. "He's using that against us." Judge Hollister nodded. "Self-defense means little when the local law is in Preston's pocket, but there's more. He's calling in political favors, trying to have me removed from the bench before I can act against him." "Can he do that?" Vivian asked, alarmed. "Not easily and not quickly, but he has influence with certain territorial officials." The judge sighed heavily. "We need those documents sooner than I thought. Preston is moving faster than anticipated." Luke straightened, his expression resolute. "Then I'll go get them myself, tonight." "Luke, no," Vivian protested. "It's too dangerous." "I can move faster alone," he countered. "Your deputies wouldn't know the exact location or how I've hidden the papers." Judge Hollister considered this. "The risk is considerable, but so is the need for haste." He moved to a cabinet, withdrawing a map which he spread across his desk. "Show me where this cabin is located." As Luke indicated the position, Vivian's mind raced through alternatives, each seeming as dangerous as the last. The thought of Luke riding back into territory crawling with Preston's men filled her with dread. "I'm coming with you," she announced suddenly. Both men turned to her with identical expressions of surprise. "Absolutely not," Luke said firmly. "You're finally safe. I won't risk that." "Those documents concern my father's murder," Vivian insisted. "I have every right to be part of recovering them." "Miss Dawson," the judge intervened gently, "while I admire your courage, Mr. Marshall is right. The danger is considerable and you've already endured more than anyone should have to." Vivian stood her ground. "With respect, Your Honor, I've proven I can handle myself. More importantly, if something happened to Luke because he was alone." She met Luke's gaze steadily. "I couldn't bear it." A tense silence filled the room as Luke studied her, his expression shifting from opposition to reluctant admiration. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, Vivian Dawson." "I prefer determined," she replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. Judge Hollister cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's a compromise. I have a property, a hunting lodge approximately halfway between here and Mr. Marshall's cabin. If you both rode there tomorrow, my deputies could meet you with fresh horses. Mr. Marshall could continue alone from there, retrieving the documents and returning to the lodge rather than making the entire journey back here." Luke considered this. "That could work. Less distance to cover with the evidence, less chance of interception. And I would be nearby if anything went wrong," Vivian added, relief evident in her voice at this solution. The judge nodded decisively. "Then it's settled. You'll leave at first light. I'll arrange for my most trusted deputy to meet you at the lodge by midday tomorrow." As they left the study to prepare for their journey, Luke caught Vivian's arm, drawing her aside in the hallway. "I want you to know," he said in a low voice, That while I'm not happy about you being anywhere near danger again, I understand why you need to be part of this." Vivian's hand came to rest against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "It's not just about my father anymore, Luke. It's about us. About the future we just spoke of. I won't stay behind while you risk everything alone." Luke's hand covered hers. "When this is over," he said softly, "when Preston is brought to justice and you're truly safe, I want us to talk about that future, about what it might look like." "I'd like that," Vivian replied, a warm certainty settling in her chest despite the challenges that lay ahead. They departed Silver Springs as planned, riding out before dawn while the town still slept. Judge Hollister provided them with fresh horses, supplies, and a detailed map to his hunting lodge. They traveled cautiously, avoiding main trails and keeping to higher ground where they could survey the surrounding terrain. By mid-morning, they had covered substantial distance without any sign of pursuit. The landscape gradually changed from open grasslands to more densely wooded foothills as they approached the judge's property. "Tell me about this cabin of yours," Vivian said as they rode side by side through a peaceful meadow dotted with wildflowers. "Is it a place you call home?" Luke considered the question. "It's shelter," he replied after a moment. "Somewhere I can rest without watching my back quite so vigilantly, but home," he shook his head. "I haven't had a true home since the war." "What was it like, your family's ranch?" Vivian asked, sensing his need to speak of it to remember. A distant smile touched Luke's lips. "Beautiful land. Not the largest spread, but good water, fertile valleys. My father raised horses, primarily had an eye for quality stock that other ranchers envied." Pride colored his voice. "Built everything with his own hands, from the main house to the smallest outbuilding, taught me to do the same." "It sounds wonderful," Vivian said softly. "It was." Luke's expression sobered. "We could see the Sangre de Cristo Mountains from the front porch. My mother used to say the way they turned red at sunset was proof that God was an artist at heart." Vivian reached across to touch his arm. "Perhaps someday you'll have that again, a place where you can watch the mountains turn red at sunset." Luke's hand covered hers briefly. "Perhaps." The way he looked at her suggested that any such future he envisioned included her beside him. They reached the hunting lodge shortly after noon, a sturdy structure built of logs and stone, nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines. Judge Hollister's deputy, a serious young man named Harris, was already waiting as promised, with fresh horses stabled in a small barn behind the main building. After a brief meal and discussion of their plans, Luke prepared to continue alone to his cabin, where the precious documents remained hidden. "I should be back by tomorrow afternoon at the latest," he told Vivian as he checked his weapons and supplies one final time. "If I'm not back by nightfall." "You will be," Vivian interrupted firmly, refusing to consider alternatives. Luke's eyes met hers, his expression grave. "If I'm not," he continued, "Deputy Harris will escort you back to Silver Springs. Promise me you won't do anything reckless." Vivian wanted to argue but recognized the necessity of his caution. "I promise, but only if you promise to return." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Luke replied with a hint of his usual confidence, though his eyes remained serious. He stepped closer, dropping his voice so only she could hear. "I've found something worth coming back for." Their goodbye was brief, but heartfelt, a lingering kiss and whispered words of caution before Luke mounted his fresh horse and disappeared into the forest, following game trails that would keep him concealed from any watchers. The hours of waiting proved more difficult than Vivian had anticipated. She paced the lodge restlessly, alternating between watching the forest edge from the windows and helping Deputy Harris maintain a vigilant guard. By nightfall, with no word from Luke, her anxiety had grown to nearly unbearable levels. "He knows what he's doing, Miss Dawson," Harris reassured her as they shared a simple dinner. "Marshall's reputation for surviving impossible situations is well earned." "You know him?" Vivian asked, surprised. Harris nodded. Know of him, more accurately. He's helped more than a few homesteaders stand against men like Preston across the territory. There's a reason he's survived this long despite the bounties that have been placed on his head. This information was both comforting and alarming. Bounties. Figure of speech, Harris backpedaled, clearly regretting his candor. Just meant he's made powerful enemies. Vivian wasn't fooled by his attempt to downplay the danger, but she appreciated learning more about the man who had come to mean so much to her in such a short time. She slept poorly that night, awakening at every sound from the forest surrounding the lodge. Dawn found her at the window, watching the tree line with tired eyes. By mid-morning, her patience had worn thin, but there was still no sign of Luke. He said afternoon, Harris reminded her gently when he found her still at her post. There's no cause for worry yet. But as morning gave way to afternoon, and afternoon began its slow transition to evening, even the stoic deputy's reassurances grew less convincing. The sun had started its descent toward the western horizon when Harris suddenly stiffened, his hand moving to his holstered revolver. Movement, he said tersely. Northwest corner of the clearing. Vivian strained to see through the trees, her heart leaping when she spotted a rider emerging from the forest. Relief turned to alarm, however, when she realized the approaching figure was slumped forward in the saddle, barely staying mounted. "It's Luke," she cried, rushing for the door. Harris caught her arm. Wait, could be a trap. But Vivian had already pulled free, racing across the clearing toward the approaching horse. As she drew closer, she could see blood staining Luke's shirt, his face pale beneath several days' growth of beard. "Luke." She called, reaching for his horse's reins, his head lifted at the sound of her voice, recognition and relief washing over his features. "Vivian," he managed weakly, attempting to dismount but nearly falling instead. Harris arrived just in time to help ease Luke from the saddle. Between them, they supported him into the lodge where they laid him carefully on a cot near the fireplace. "What happened?" Vivian demanded, already working to remove his blood-soaked shirt. Luke grimaced as the fabric pulled away from his wound a deep gash across his upper chest, not from a bullet but from what appeared to be a knife. "Ambush," he explained through gritted teeth. 2 miles from my cabin, 3 of Preston's men were waiting. How did they know?" Harris asked, bringing water and clean cloths. "Don't think they did specifically," Luke replied, wincing as Vivian began cleaning his wound. "Standing guard on the approaches to the area would have stopped anyone. The documents." Vivian asked, though her primary concern was clearly his condition. Luke managed a pained smile. "Safe." He nodded toward his saddlebags, which Harris quickly retrieved. "All of it. Your father's evidence. Mine too." As Harris examined the contents of the bags, Vivian focused on treating Luke's wound. It was deep but clean, the blood flow already slowing. "You'll need stitches," she informed him. "Wouldn't be the first time," Luke replied, his attempt at lightheartedness undermined by the tightness around his eyes. Deputy Harris returned from examining the documents, his expression one of barely contained excitement. "This is more than enough," he announced. "With these records, Judge Hollister can move against Preston immediately. There are land deeds, banking records, even letters between Preston and officials he bribed." "My father's work," Vivian said softly, pride mixing with grief. "And yours," Luke added, his hand finding hers despite his pain. "He'd be proud of what you've done." Harris gathered the documents carefully. "I need to get these to Judge Hollister immediately. Will you be all right here until I can send help?" Vivian nodded confidently. "I can tend his wounds. We'll be fine." After the deputy departed, riding hard for Silver Springs with the precious evidence, Vivian set about the task of properly treating Luke's injury. With steady hands, she cleaned, stitched, and bandaged the gash, grateful for the practical skills her frontier upbringing had provided. Throughout the process, Luke watched her with an expression that mingled pain with something deeper, more profound. When she finally sat back, having completed her work, he caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Marry me," he said simply. Vivian blinked, certain she had misheard. "What?" Marry me, Luke repeated, his blue eyes steady despite his weakened state. I know it's sudden. I know we've known each other just days, but I've lived enough to recognize something true when I find it. Luke, Vivian began, overwhelmed by the unexpected proposal. You're injured, possibly feverish, never been more clear-headed, he interrupted. Nearly dying has a way of bringing priorities into focus. His thumb traced circles on her palm. I don't have much to offer, no land, no fortune, just my word that I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you. Tears pricked at Vivian's eyes. You think I care about land or fortune after everything we've been through? What do you care about then? Luke asked softly. Vivian's free hand came to rest against his cheek. A good man who found me when I was at my lowest point and said, "Don't you dare give up on me now." A man who risked everything for justice, not just for himself but for others. Her voice caught. A man I've somehow fallen in love with despite every logical reason to be cautious. Hope dawned in Luke's eyes. Is that a yes? It's a when you're healed and Preston is brought to justice. Ask me properly, Vivian replied with a tremulous smile. Then it will be a yes. Luke's answering smile was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. I can work with that, he murmured, drawing her down for a gentle kiss that held promises of all that was to come. 2 days later, Judge Hollister arrived at the lodge with a small contingent of deputies, and a doctor who confirmed that Vivian's care of Luke's wound had been exemplary. The judge brought news that electrified them. Both warrants had been issued for Preston's arrest, and federal marshals were already on their way to Copper Creek to execute them. The evidence was overwhelming, Hollister explained as they gathered around the lodge's large table. Preston's empire is crumbling as we speak. Properties illegally seized are being returned to their rightful owners, including your father's ranch, Vivian. And the men who murdered her father? Luke asked, sitting upright despite the doctor's admonitions to rest. The judge's expression was grimly satisfied. Arrested this morning along with the corrupt sheriff who helped cover up the crime. Justice may have been delayed, but it will not be denied. As spring blossomed into early summer across the Arizona territory, Harlan Preston's trial became the talk of every settlement from Tucson to Santa Fe. The evidence presented was damning: years of corruption, forgery, and violence laid bare for all to see. When the verdict of guilty was read on all counts, Vivian sat in the courthouse beside Luke, their hands clasped tightly together as a chapter of darkness finally closed. With Preston sentenced to 20 years in federal prison and his accomplices receiving similar punishments, the way was clear for healing to begin throughout the county. Properties were returned, including the Dawson ranch that had been Vivian's childhood home. On a perfect June morning, with the mountains visible in the distance and wildflowers dotting the meadows surrounding the rebuilt ranch house, Vivian stood before Judge Hollister in a simple white dress, her hand in Luke's as they exchanged vows witnessed by the small community that had embraced them both. I promised to ask you properly when I was healed and justice was done, Luke had said the previous evening as they walked along the creek that bordered the property. Dropping to one knee, he had presented a simple gold band. Vivian Dawson, will you make me the happiest man in the territory and become my wife? Her yes had been immediate and certain, the culmination of a journey that had begun in danger and desperation, but flowered into something neither could have imagined when they first met. As summer gave way to autumn, the Dawson Marshall Ranch became known not only for its fine horses, but as a haven for those seeking justice against powerful interests. Luke's reputation as a man who stood for the defenseless spread, bringing both challenges and opportunities. But through it all, he and Vivian faced each day together, building the home and the future they had once thought beyond reach. On the first anniversary of the day Luke had found Vivian collapsed beside her fallen horse, they sat together on the porch of their ranch house, watching the distant mountains turn red with the setting sun. You ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Vivian asked, her head resting against Luke's shoulder, her hand protectively cradling the slight swell of her belly where their first child grew. Luke's arm tightened around her. "Every day," he admitted. "If I'd been riding a different trail, if I'd been just minutes later. If Penny hadn't given her life to get me as far as she did," Vivian added softly, having long since made peace with the loss of her loyal mare. "A lot of ifs," Luke agreed, his hand covering hers over their unborn child. "But what I think about most isn't how it might have gone wrong, but how incredible it is that everything aligned to bring us together." Vivian smiled, turning to meet his gaze. "When you found me there, half-conscious, what made you say those words? Don't you dare give up on me now." Luke considered this, his expression thoughtful. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. Something in your eyes, maybe, a fighter's spirit I recognized." His voice softened. "Or perhaps some part of me already knew you were my future even then." As the last rays of sunlight gilded the landscape in gold, Vivian leaned up to kiss the man who had changed her life with an act of courage and 6 simple words. Whatever had brought them together, chance, fate, or providence, she was eternally grateful for the journey that had led them home. In the years that followed, the legend of how Lucas Marshall had found Vivian Dawson became a story told throughout the territory, a tale of courage, justice, and a love that had begun in the darkest of circumstances, but blossomed into something that gave hope to all who heard it. Their ranch became not just a home, but a symbol of what was possible when good people refused to surrender to evil, when they chose instead to fight for what was right. And on quiet evenings, long after their children had grown and begun families of their own, Luke and Vivian would still sometimes sit together on that same porch, watching the mountains turn red at sunset. Grateful for every moment of the life, they had built together a life that had nearly ended before it began on a dusty plain where a cowboy found a woman whose horse had died beneath her, and whose spirit had captured his heart with a strength that matched his own.